use this marry the house, date the rate strategy to get the house that you like, lock it in while it's off peak prices. Yes, it sucks. You have to stomach the monthly payments for a shorter period of time, but you use that kind of short-term approach. You bake in your lifestyle, you make the adjustments for the next 36 months or so, and then thereafter you have your house, you're in the market, you refinance, you readjust your payments to something that you're more comfortable with, and you ride out the rest of the market while it recovers, because we know that while interest rates are low, typically that's when prices are up. Marry the house and date the rate. It's this sexy phrase that keeps going around in today's real estate market, but what does it actually mean for you? My name's Emma, and I run a real estate team in Toronto called Monstera Real Estate, and we help millennials build a path to get to their dream home through our first to forever home strategy. And what we've recently released is a free report that goes through 5 strategies that renters can utilize in today's market for 2023 to help you go from renting to home ownership. And this marry the house, date the rate strategy is one of the strategies that we discuss in that free report. If you're actually interested in getting a copy of that report, there's a link in the description below, but no pressure. This is going to break down the first strategy in that report. Now, before we get into how these 2 concepts work together, the marry the house and the date the rate, I want to provide you some content or context around how rates usually move, and I want to show you some supporting data to help kind of get this point across. So the easiest way to do that is to preface this video by showcasing this chart. And if you're not analytical, honestly, don't worry about it. I'm going to explain this to you. The only thing that I really want you to focus on are the yellow lines and the green lines. So if you know that the yellow line is the interest rate and the green line is inflation, we're cool. And so what you're going to notice is this represents 1970 to 2022. And so what you're going to notice is over the last 40 years or so, interest rates and inflation tend to move together, right? So when inflation is quite high, so are interest rates. They come down together, they move up together, they come down together, they move up together. You can see that over time, for the most part, they move pretty well in tandem. And so you might be at home thinking, well, duh. But if you're at home and you're thinking, duh, and you're not currently a homeowner, or you're thinking about making a move and you haven't yet done so, it's likely because you fall into one of these 2 schools of thought. And so our team typically has around 1,000 conversations a week or so with potential purchasers or sellers in the market. And this is kind of what I've broken down, the main concepts that are holding people back in today's market. So I wanted to break down what both of the schools of thought were, because they're both valid, but they're both based off 2 opposite premises. And so I want to break them down and then show you at the end of the video how we marry the 2 together to give you a harmonious strategy to take advantage of what's going on in today's market. So again, there's 2 schools of thought. The first one is I want to wait for rates to come down, right? I want to wait for rates to decrease. And the second one is I want to wait for prices to decrease before I make a move. And so what I wanted to do was to break down the pros and the cons of each of these schools of thought, and then look into an all-encompassing approach. So if you fall into one of these schools of thought, we'll go through the pros and the cons together, and then we'll try and figure out a way to pair the 2 together to make you happy. So let's talk about the first one, which is rates coming down. So the 2 benefits of waiting for rates to come down would be that you get lower monthly payments, and or you can qualify for more, especially if you've got a low budget or you're an entry-level price point in your given market, okay? So that would be the benefit of waiting for rates to come down. Now, I prefaced this video by showing you interest rates and inflation together for a specific purpose. So I put this together in a particular sequence. So what we saw is typically when when inflation comes down and rates come down, I'm going to show you in a second what happens with prices, but normally prices go up. And so buyers, the two kind of cons would be buyers would lose leverage in negotiations. So maybe you have more competition in the marketplace. Right now you have the opportunity to include conditions. So financing, home inspection, status certificate review for a couple of days when you purchase, which is something that we hadn't seen when interest rates were really, really low and the market was quite rampant. So yes, if rates come down, you likely lose some leverage in your negotiation. And then lastly, you likely pay a little bit more for the house, and we're going to look at that in a second. And a cascading effect of paying more for the house is that you also need to pay more for closing costs. So like your land transfer tax is going to be more expensive. Your down payment is going to be larger if you're paying more for the house. And so to support that, I've basically pulled the price trends from 2019 to 2022 to kind of show you, again, we know the relationship between interest rates and inflation, and now we need to look at the relationship between price and interest rates. So as we see here, the general direction of prices from 2019 to early 2022, which is when we started to see the hike of interest rates, is we have a general trajectory of upward prices. Now, we obviously see seasonality. If you want to learn more about seasonality, check out my market update because I went through exactly how things usually work from a market cycles perspective. But overall, we see some ups and downs on the way up for the most part. And obviously I put a little caveat there for COVID, which doesn't happen very frequently. So we have a general upward trend while prices are coming down. So we can see that these two things work in opposite directions, unlike interest rates and inflation. And then what happens? Boom, we see interest rates take a steep incline, and then we obviously see as that happens, the price trajectory tends to come down. And so here are three things. If you're in the school of thought of waiting for rates to come down, there are three questions that I want you to ask yourself to get a better understanding of if that is actually going to make sense for you. Because for some people it will, and for some people it won't. So there's three questions that I want you to ask yourself for you to make the strongest decision for yourself. And if the answer to all three of these questions is yes, then I think your point is valid, and maybe you do wait for rates to come down. So the first thing is, are you okay with the potential to pay more for the house? So, yes, you get a better payment, but are you okay if the house costs you more? Yes? Okay, perfect. The second thing is, are you willing to pay more for closing costs? And or do you have the funds to pay more for additional closing costs? So, okay, yes, I want rates to come down, and I have the funds available that if I have to pay a little bit more for the house, I do have that slush fund available. So we have yes and yes, okay? Then the third thing is, are you willing to compete with other buyers and or lose some leverage in negotiations? So condition lengths, potentially conditions in total, because what I do know is if rates come back down to, we won't even necessarily say this particular level, they come down here, we know that in 2019 and here, what the market was like with buyers, and it was much more competitive than it is today while we see prices on the downward trajectory. So are you okay with that? Right? Some people, it really stresses them out to know that they have to compete with other buyers and they just want to be the only buyer at the table. And so if you're the person that really values being the only buyer at the table, then I think the strategy at the end of this video makes a lot of sense for you. If you're like, I don't care, I just need lower rates so I can qualify for more, I have the cash, I don't care about competing, it's all good, then I think your strategy probably makes sense for you. Now, the one last question, if you said yes to all three of those things and you're on the rate reduction side from a school of thought perspective, the last question that I would urge you to ask yourself is, when will rates be low enough for you specifically? Because much like we're going to talk about prices in a second, if we don't draw a line in the sand for ourselves, this can become a very slippery slope when new information comes out. So if what I teach you in the rest of this video doesn't make any sense for you, that's okay. But my advice would be for you to draw a line in the sand for yourself so that there isn't like this constant moving target, right? It's like, do the math and figure out, okay, right now rates are at 5.5. If rates were to come down to 4.25, this would be my affordability, this would be my payment, and this would be when I would be comfortable entering the market. Because if you don't draw that line in the sand for yourself, you just constantly have this moving target. And I see that a lot. So make sure that you're not just waiting for rates to come down. It's like you can wait for rates to come down, but have an actual target for yourself where it makes sense and that you have a tangible plan of action for yourself. Okay. Then let's move on to the second school of thought. And the second school of thought would be waiting for prices to come down. And so the people who are waiting for rates to come down, for the most part, are understanding that they're waiting for rates to come down with the intention that prices might move up. We have the opposite school of thought, which is I'm just going to wait for prices to continue to decrease. Okay. And so if you fall into the right-hand side of the chart that I originally showed you, let's discuss the pros and cons. So if prices continue to come down more, you likely have better leverage in your negotiations because, again, you probably have fairly low competition in the marketplace. Two, a benefit, which is the opposite of seeing rates come down, is that you have less closing costs because you're paying less for the house if you're waiting for prices to come down. And then the two cons would be that you're likely actually paying the same or greater from a monthly payment perspective. And much like I did with the other two, I'm going to show you some supporting documents so that you know I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. And then the last thing is you likely have a low inventory. So unless we see a mass amount of sellers come to the market and happen to be desperate to sell, most often these sellers go, okay, well, I don't want to take a haircut on the price of my property, so I'll just sit and wait. And that means that you might not have a big selection of homes to choose from. So we'll talk about that again in a second. But before we do that, I want to go through an example of payments. So let me actually show you this slide first. So I'm going to use an example of a property that was worth $1 million at the peak, right? And at this point in time, like if you've paid any attention to really any market in Southwestern Ontario, you probably understand that prices have come down for the most part 20 to 30% in most segments of the market or most locations in and markets in Southwestern Ontario. So I'm going to use a 20% price reduction because I think that's pretty fair given where we're at from last February, which was the peak of the market for most markets. So if a property was worth $1 million last February and we put 20% down and we look at the rates that we could have got, which was 2.15%, our monthly payment for $1 million house would have been $34.46, right? So almost $34.50 per month. Now, let's look at that exact same house with current rates at current price reductions. And so that's going to look like $800,000 with 20% down at a current 5-year fixed rate, let's say, because I used 5-year to keep things the same. So 4.84 today. And so your payment is $3,664. And so you're paying an additional $218 per month to be able to get the $200,000 price discount. So I don't actually think the price argument is a bad argument if you believe that we are going to continue to see drastic rate increases. Personally, I don't think that we're likely to see the same type of aggressiveness when it comes to rate increases going forward as what we had seen in 2022. But again, I'm not asking you to, you believe whatever you want. I just want to showcase some examples to you here. So again, now I want to go to what questions I believe you should ask yourself to make the strongest decision for yourself and understand that if waiting for prices to come down is actually the right thing for you to do. And so there's 3 questions that I want you to ask yourself if you fall on this school of thought. And that would be 1, are you okay with a higher or potential higher monthly payment to buy the property at a greater discount? Would you have the income stability and the confidence in job security? And, would you be willing to potentially sacrifice some of your lifestyle with holding a higher monthly payment for a certain period of time to buy the property at a greater discount? Okay, yes or no? The second thing isn't necessarily a yes or no question. I could turn it into a yes or no question on the spot here, but like, how long do you intend to hold this property for? So do you want to hold this property for 5 years or less, or do you want to hold this property for 5 years or more? Okay. And then the last thing is, do I actually value the selection of homes that I get to choose from, or am I solely looking for a deal? So I want you to go back and assess those 3 questions. So like, can I float, and am I willing to float the higher monthly payment? Am I holding this thing for a long time, or do I want to sell it in the shorter term? And then, the third thing is, do I actually care about the house that I buy, or am I just straight up looking for a good deal to get into the market? Okay. So depending on those answers, then again, I want to go back and I want to, ask you the last question that I urge you to ask yourself. And that is, when will prices be low enough for you specifically? Right? Because at the beginning of this rate slide, most people when we were having conversations, were saying, 20% off the peak, like that would be a great deal. That would be something enticing enough for me to want to get into the marketplace. And we're at that or beyond that at this point in time. And there's still some people that haven't necessarily taken action. And so not to say that you should, but again, I want you to ask yourself, when will prices be low enough for you? And the ultimate whole, the overall point of this particular school of thought or argument makes a lot of sense, because the reason why people have this thought process is like, dude, I just don't want to overpay, right? Like, I don't want to overpay in today's market. I want to make sure that I'm getting a decent deal, and I just don't want to overpay. Like, ultimately, and that makes a lot of sense, because nobody wants to overpay for real estate. So I get where this is coming from. However, if you are in this school of thought, and this is where I've seen many, many people get caught in the past, is waiting and waiting and waiting without, again, having that like line drawn in the sand or some type of tangible marker for themselves to understand what a good price is, or when prices, when you're waiting for prices to go down until, and then what happens is they wait, the market turns, and they actually overall forfeit the dream of home ownership, because, and this is understandable, once you see that inflection point in a graph, you feel like I missed the mark. And it can be really hard if you've already bought into this school of thought of, I'm going to wait for prices to come down. And let's say you miss the mark. It can be really hard to convince yourself or justify paying for a house or paying more for a house when you saw it sell, for less a couple of months ago, and now the market's turned around. And so I think this school of thought, it makes sense, but it is, unless you draw that line in the sand, it can be a very slippery slope. And if you don't time the market perfectly, it can be really hard, if you miss the market even by a small window, to justify and get back in to the marketplace, because you feel like, all right, well, my strategy didn't work and I missed it. I'll just have to wait till the next time comes around, right? And so ultimately, I don't want that to happen for you, because if you're watching this video, you're already 10 times ahead of most buyers. You're doing research, you're spending time, you're spending energy, you're spending effort, like you're taking time away from other things that may be more enjoyable than you sitting here watching me talk about strategies on the internet. And the last thing I'd want you to do is spend all this time, energy, effort, research without having that line in the sand. And then in 3, I don't even want to give a time frame actually. Whenever the market rebounds, you haven't taken action, and you don't end up taking action after spending all of this time, energy, and effort into learning about all of this, right? And so, again, I'm not a huge time the market type of person. I'm definitely more time in the market. And so I really do want you to ask yourself, if you fall in this school of thought, when will prices be low enough for you to take action? Because this is a much more slippery slope that can continue to compound as prices come down. You're like, I'm just going to keep waiting. I'm going to keep waiting. I'm going to keep waiting. And they need to get lower, and they need to get lower. And then at some point in time, they turn around. And if you haven't taken action, again, it can be, I don't want to, beat a dead horse here, for lack of a better term, but, it can be hard to justify mentally getting past that barrier. So Now we're going to lead into the marry the house, date the rate. And so what I did was I went back and I grabbed, because we need to look ahead now. So we've looked back and we've seen what's happened with interest rate and inflation moving together. We've looked at prices and interest rates, which move opposite of each other. And now we understand what the pros and cons are of waiting for rates to come down even further with the hopes that prices are going to go down. So now what we need to do is we actually need to look ahead to see what the likelihood and probability of that happening really is. And so I went back to the Bank of Canada's most recent press release, and I took the last line out of the press release, which is where I usually find the most valuable information is, because it kind of sets the tone for like what's going to happen next, right? So it says, we're resolute in our commitment to achieving the 2% inflation target and restoring price stability for Canadians. Okay. Awesome. So what they let us know is that they're adamant on getting inflation back to 2%. And so if I go back to the initial slide that I had here for you guys, then we can see what usually happens is like inflation is high and then interest rates come down. Inflation is high and interest rates come down. So my question for you is, knowing how this has worked in the past, if they believe or they're resolute in their efforts to making sure that inflation gets down to 2%, what do you think is going to happen to interest rates if that is in their plan, right? And so we know that inflation and interest rates tend to move like fairly similarly. So I would assume that interest rates come down to, I don't want to say 2%, but like less than what we have today, okay? Then we follow through and go, okay, sick, but when is that going to happen, right? And so then I went back and I found out like what are their expectations from a timing perspective on when this is actually going to happen. So then you can see here the Bank of Canada expects inflation to fall to about 3% in late 2023 and then return to 2% in 2024. Okay, so at the time of making this video, it's the beginning of 2023. So they're expecting that it falls to this point by the end of this year. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I'm not going to make any plans on their expected dates. So I want to give myself a little bit more wiggle room, and I'm going to assume by like 2026 they actually get this stuff in order, and that they don't. I'm just going to assume that they don't get it in order by 2024. We'll give ourselves a buffer, and that is where I'm going to show you the marry the house, date the rate strategy and how to get the best of both worlds. But I want to again preface this with like, this strategy only makes sense if you actually want to hold real estate for a decent amount of time. So in this example that I'm going to show you, I'm going to assume that we buy this property with the intention of holding it between 5 to 10 years. And so I'm going to use 8 years as an example. And if you don't want to buy real estate with a long-term strategy, unless you're really advanced, just even at this point in the video, you're like, I want to buy for a year or two. I just wouldn't do it unless you were a really advanced purchaser and knew exactly what you were doing. If you're just like praying and hoping, I don't think it's a great strategy. I think if you have like a 5 to 10 year plan and you're like, yep, it's cool, I have job stability, I really want to be a homeowner, I'm cool to like ride this thing out for the next 5 to 10 years, and I really like the area that I'm purchasing in, I think this is a great strategy. So let's move on and I'll give you an example. So we're going to go back to that $1 million house that has now had a price reduction of about 20%, and we're purchasing it at $800K, and we're assuming that you want to own this house for about 8 years. So we're going to assume that you buy this $800,000 house in 2023, and we're going to use a 3-year fixed rate. And so this is where the marry the house, date the rate thing comes in. So we're marrying the house at the lower price because we love it and we're buying it for less. We have less closing costs, et cetera, et cetera. But everybody hates high interest rates, me included. Trust me, I'm paying more for my mortgages than I would really, really like right now. But we're going to assume that we're just dating the rate and that I am going to get over the hump of the fact that I have to pay a higher interest rate in the short term. So we're going to assume that we are buying the house with a 3-year fixed rate. And what you're going to notice is now all of a sudden the interest rate is even higher than what I showed you guys earlier. And you're like, what the heck? This makes no sense. So the bank is going to charge you more money for a shorter term for 3 years than 5 years because in what I showed you earlier at 4.84, you're guaranteeing the bank 4.84% for the next 5 years. However, because of what we just looked at with the expectations for the Bank of Canada and me doubling their time frame, so assuming this is happening in 2026 because they are resolute in that commitment, I'm going to assume that by the time this comes up, inflation is under control and the rates come back down to more normal levels, which we'll look back in a second. So right now, what I have done is my payments have actually gone from 36.64 or something like that to 38.50. So I'm paying an additional $200 a month on top of what I showed you before, and I'm paying $400 a month for 3 years, more than what I would have been paying if I bought the house at $1 million. So why am I personally okay with that? Because $400 a month times 12 is $4,800 a year, and $4,800 a year times 3 is $14,400. Sucks. It's the cost of doing business. It's like what I call like the discount tax to get this property at a lower cost. So in order for me to pay or to save $200,000 on the purchase price, I got to pay a $14,400 bank tax to them, and we're net ahead by, what does that come out to? $185,600. Okay, I'm down to trade $14,000 for $200,000 all day long. Seems like a good deal, right? Now let's fast forward to 2026, which is when we assume that things are finally under control. If they get under control beforehand, good for the Bank of Canada, not so great for us because now we're locked into a fixed rate, but it doesn't matter because we're going to know the math by the time we go to refinance. So we fast forward to 2026, we assume that things are finally under control, and now I assume rates go from 5.34 to 3.25 because inflation and interest moves together, and I assume that they have inflation under control. So on the third year, the bank calls you and goes, hey, you bought the house, you bought the house 3 years ago, and it's time for your mortgage renewal, and we need to refinance. And so we still own the same house at $800K, but now we are able to refinance at a better rate. And our payment, look what happens to our payment. So we have done nothing. We haven't even changed the term. We've taken no money out. We've put no additional money down, nothing. We just changed the rate when inflation gets under control, and our payments now go down by $700 a month. Okay, so what that's going to do is one of two things. So in this scenario, kind of some bummers. You're going to have to probably tighten up a little bit on your lifestyle. So, groceries and stuff are already high, but you're probably going to have to tighten up a little bit. And from a lifestyle perspective, with going out with your friends and doing all that kind of fun stuff, you might have to make some additional sacrifices. Okay, so when you get to this point in 3 years from now, though, you have two options. You have either, and what will happen for a lot of people is they will adjust their lifestyle and become comfortable with this payment, because it's just like over 3 years, you're like, okay, it just is what it is. I can tell you that because this has happened to me over the last 8 months, given the fact that I've got a variable rate. I've just become comfortable. I don't want to say comfortable, but I've just adjusted my lifestyle to understand that my payments have changed. And so when our variable rate goes back down, I get two options, which is the exact same option that you guys will have in the second scenario. And that is, I've become comfortable with that, so I can save that money and put it in a savings account because I'm already accounting for it and I've adjusted my lifestyle for that initial payment, and now I get this extra. Or two, I get to reduce my payments and I get that extra lifestyle back if I really want. So I can, put it in my savings account, or I can put it in my lifestyle account. Okay. Totally up to you with whatever you want to do. So you have the additional $700 a month to play with. So you can either recoup that $1,440 that we paid over the last 3 years and pay that off and be kind of like net neutral within, it would probably be about like a year and a half or so. Or you become comfortable with that monthly payment and you're like, okay, yeah, I'm just going to save the extra $700 for when I decide that I want to move again, or maybe I want to do a renovation, or maybe you have kids and you want to save for their school, whatever it happens to be. You've got the additional $700 a month to do that. And Now what I'm going to assume is when you go to refinance, we're doing this on, let's say, a 5-year fixed rate at that point in time. So I had mentioned previously that this is an 8-year plan. The first 3 years is the higher rate, and the second half of the home ownership is the 5 years at the lower monthly payment. And you're like, okay, cool. You know what? At the end of these 8 years, I've lived in this house. I want to upsize and I want to make a move. And so what I want to do for you now is I want to showcase how you actually make a move and get ahead and get your dream house. And I'm going to use the TREB average annual appreciation, because we already know that when rates go down, usually prices go up. And so I don't want to use the 2019 to 2020 Feb 2022 average appreciation rate, because it wasn't something that I could bet on over the last 40 years. So I'm going to use the TREB average appreciation over the last 40 years, which was 6%. If we get more than that, massive bonus. Let's just use 6%. So we bought the house for $800K. I assume that we have 0 appreciation for the first 3 years. Well, we own it at that $200,000 discount. And we start to see our house appreciate after the 3rd year. So the 3rd to the 8th year. So that 5-year span of whenever we refinance at the lower rate, we start to see that, excuse me, average annual TREB appreciation. So we are going to assume that we get that 6%. So $800K with 6% annual compound interest is just over $1,070,000. I actually think it's $1,070,000. I might have made an error there. So instead of $1,076,000, it's $1,070,000. So we have now made $270,000 or $276,000 with my error here. We've made in the market holding for 8 years using TREB's average annual appreciation. We have saved $42,000 from that $700 a month after we've adjusted our price on that, or after we've adjusted our rate on that refinance. And then we also still have our initial down payment, which was the 20%, so the $160,000 that we put down when we bought the house for $800K. So by the time 8 years rolls around, we have $478,000 approximately. It would actually be $472,000 if we adjust my mistake there, to go and purchase another property, should you so choose. If you decide like this house is maybe a little bit too small, or the condo is too small, whatever it happens to be, but you got into the market. What I can say fairly confidently is, even in the peak of the market in February of 2022, if you would have had this amount of cash, you would have been able to purchase a fairly decent sized home that would be comfortable for most people in Toronto. Okay. And we started all of this with the $160,000 in down payment. And the last thing that I wanted to just make reference to is, this is not very far beyond the peak of where we were in February 2022. So I'm just assuming over the next 8 years, we kind of get back to where we were previous to this. I'm not really expecting that we're going beyond the peak, even though internally I think we'll probably be beyond this. I just wanted to use some fairly conservative numbers of how you could do this and use this, marry the house, date the rate strategy to get the house that you like, lock it in while it's off peak prices. Yes, it sucks. You have to stomach the monthly payments for a shorter period of time, but you use that kind of short-term approach. You bake in your lifestyle, you make the adjustments for the next 36 months or so, and then thereafter you have your house, you're in the market, you refinance, you readjust your payments to something that you're more comfortable with, and you ride out the rest of the market while it recovers, because we know that while interest rates are low, typically that's when prices are up. So at this point in time, you're able to purchase at a discount, you're able to leverage the benefits that you have as a buyer in today's market. So like less competition, being able to buy without, a bidding war, you're able to buy with conditions, all of the things that people were unable to do that they were complaining about at the peak of the market. You're buying at the discount, you get that leverage, you hold on. The thing that sucks about it is that you have to adjust your lifestyle and you have to make those higher payments for a short period of time. But after that, because we know that inflation and interest rates tend to move together, and that the Bank of Canada is resolute in getting inflation back to their target, we can expect that interest rates will go down based on what we saw with that historical data. We refinance, we keep the house that we bought at a discount, we get the payments that we want in the future, we ride it out, we get the average annual TREB appreciation, and that is how we build a strategy for you. So for some people that watch this video, this is going to knock it out of the park. For some of you, you're not going to be convinced. You're going to go with whatever strategy you want to anyways, but I hope this provided some further insight one way or the other on the pros and the cons, how inflation and interest rates work, how interest rates and prices work, and then the overall average monthly payment. So I hope you got something out of this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up, a like, and a subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one.